If one day life forced you to stand in front of a church preparing to marry a man you never loved, just because it was the only way to keep your roof over your head, what would you do? In the late 19th century West, where the wind carries dust and fate is often decided by unquestioned pieces of paper, Mara Ellsworth, a young widow from the town of Ash Hollow, finds herself in just such a predicament. Her husband, Owen Ellsworth, has just died under mysterious circumstances, and immediately his younger brother, the ambitious Barnett Price, has issued a strange will, forcing Mara to marry him within 90 days or lose everything. A lone woman, a town full of prejudice, a seemingly dead end. If it were you, would you bow your head and accept it, or risk stepping into the darkness out there where there is only a fragile belief in something good? Just when fate seemed to be closing in, a man from the West appeared. James Rowe, a quiet cowboy riding through the red dust of Willowbend. He promised nothing, asked nothing, only made a statement that made the listener's heart tremble. If you are not strong enough to stand up, borrow my strength first. Would a woman with her back against the wall dare to bet her life on a stranger? Would she dare to choose freedom, even if it costs her everything? We invite you to step into the story, a journey of healing, honor, and rebirth of the heart. Please like, share, and subscribe to my channel to start this emotional journey with me. Mornings in Ash Hollow always begin with the pale light of a late autumn sun. That light, a thin gold streak across the dusty fields and rickety wooden porches, makes the place look both beautiful and weary, like a man far past his youth and yet still moving on. Anyone who has lived more than half a lifetime knows that the late 19th century frontier was not a place for the faint of heart. Yet it is in this harsh land that stories of dignity, kindness, and quiet endurance are born, stories that remind one that people always try to find a little light, even when darkness clings. In a landscape of seemingly only whistling winds and rotting fences, Mara Ellsworth emerged as a different note. Before her life became difficult, she was the soul of Ellsworth and Sons, a place where the townspeople came not only to buy things but also because of Mara's gentleness, sophistication, and thoughtfulness. She knew each customer's favorite flower, the right fabric for their wife's winter coat, or simply how to make a cup of hot tea to soothe the cold hands of a man who had just returned from the farm. In a place where harshness always preceded kindness, Mara was a rare exception. But then Owen Ellsworth, her husband, died of a sudden fever. The people of Ash Hollow still say that the wind blew harder than usual on the day of his funeral, as if the land itself wanted to bow its head in farewell to a kind man. Mara stood before the grave, her eyes dry, not because she had run out of tears, but because the pain was so deep that her body refused to express anything more. Loss was so common on the frontier that people rarely had the chance to give themselves to mourning. Just days after the funeral, before the emptiness had even subsided, another devastating news came. Owen's new will was published. What stunned everyone was not the content but the chilling absurdity of its words. According to the document, if Mara did not marry Barnett Price, Owen's cousin, also an ambitious acting sheriff, within 90 days, all of Mara's assets, including the department store, would be transferred to Barnett's management. At first glance, it might seem like an old-fashioned custom to protect widows. But anyone who has lived in Ash Hollow knows that Barnett is the kind of man women avoid looking directly into. His gaze feels like a dull blade sliding across wood, quiet, sharp, and instinctively repulsed. He had hinted at pursuing Mara even while Owen was still alive, and it was that stubbornness that kept the townspeople at a distance. So when the will was read in the town hall, a heavy silence fell over the room. It was not just a silence of shock, but also a silence of choked-up anger, for Barnett's intentions were well known. A young widow, recently bereaved, now forced into a loveless marriage just to keep the home she had spent years building that would break the heart of any sane person. Adding to the melancholy of the story was a whisper from Mr. Curtis, an old blacksmith who had lived in Ash Hollow for over 40 years. As people gathered on the terrace of the tavern to discuss the oddity of the will, he simply said, his voice a mixture of sand and wind, "I've seen Owen sign it many times. The handwriting on the will doesn't look like his." No one dared say it aloud. On the frontier, accusing a powerful official was something that could result in a family disappearing into obscurity. But Mr. Curtis's words, though quiet, sounded like a stirring of truth under the thick dust of fear. From here Mara's tragedy truly takes on a name, not just a widow forced into an old social mold, not just a woman facing the risk of losing her entire life's work, but a person being pushed into a corner by someone who wants to use the law to take over both her property and her future. To understand the full gravity of the situation, one must look back at the nature of Ash Hollow, a town so barren that the idea of freedom for women seems a luxury. Here, widows are often seen as unfinished business, a social burden, rather than an individual with the right to choose their own path. The traditional rules established by previous generations, though unwritten, are as binding as barbed wire around a field. And so, Mara's pain doesn't just come from Barnett or from the unjust will. It comes from the fact that she's been robbed of her right to be herself. Once the soft heart of Ellsworth and Sons, she's been turned into property to be managed, an object for men to fight over in the name of law. This, for older viewers, those who've seen the harsh times in their own lives, is deeply relatable, the sense of being misplaced, misunderstood by society, forced to do something against one's dignity. And at this point, the Frontier Heart storyteller often keeps a very slow pace. Slow not to prolong the pain, but to respect the gravity of the situation, because sometimes silence is the best way for the listener to feel a heart being compressed. Mara stood in front of the cabin, looking at the bars on the windows Owen had closed on windy nights. Every object held a memory, from the silver cups they'd used to receive merchants to the lace shawl she'd sewn for their 3rd anniversary. But now everything was slipping away from her, not because of fate, but because of one man's manipulation. As the town bustled, Mara sat quietly behind the counter, watching her hands shake with every little movement. She knew she could give up the shop, leave Ash Hollow, and start a new life somewhere else. But giving up would mean letting Barnett take over Owen's legacy, turning all her husband's hard work into a greedy man's spoils. That, for a woman like Mara, who considers family honor non-negotiable, is an insult more painful than malicious rumors. It was in that moment that the tragedy reached its full potential. The woman was forced into a choice with no way out, and the audience intuitively understood that the story was not just about pain. It was about to unfold a crucial turning point. And just when Ash Hollow seemed to have closed all escape routes, when despair began to settle over Mara's heart, like the gray dust of the wasteland, a figure appeared from the end of the dirt, road silent as the wind, but carrying with it the feeling that life was about to change. That afternoon, the sky over Ash Hollow darkened in what the town elders called a sign of great things. Not rain, not a storm, just a dull light that made everything seem to hold its breath. Mara stood behind the counter, looking out the window. In the distance, on the rutted road, a man on horseback approached. His shadow lengthened in the late afternoon light, falling on the ground like a straight line, giving the scene a somewhat solemn air of fate. When the horse stopped before the porch, Mara gave a brief start. The man didn't belong in Ash Hollow. That much was obvious from the way he sat in the saddle, from the gentle but firm way he held the reins, and from the way he swept his gaze around the town, as if to make sure he was looking in the right place, the right person. James Rowe was his name. That name would later, for many, be the beginning of a new chapter in Mara's life. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair ruffled by the prairie wind. His leather jacket was frayed, his trousers were dusty, and his boots bore the marks of a long journey. But what drew attention was not his weathered appearance, but his eyes, deep, deep blue, and with the experience of someone who had witnessed much loss but had not let it turn him into a bitter person. Mara stood still as he entered. Something about James's presence made the room seem larger, airier. Not because he carried himself with power or authority, but because he carried himself with calm, the quality that troubled souls often notice first. James took off his hat and bowed slightly, in the polite manner of the Old West. His voice was low, soft, but clear. "I was sent by Mr. Walter Carlin. He said you were in trouble." Walter Carlin, old friend of Owen, had been the Ellsworth's freighter for many winters. He lived in the Timberline Ridge area, nearly 2 days' ride from Ash Hollow. That he'd sent someone here at this time of year was enough to make Mara's spine tingle a little. She clenched the handkerchief she was holding, trying to keep her voice from shaking. I "I don't know why, Mr. Carlin sent you. I have no one to trust but myself, and I'm not sure I have the strength to trust it anymore." James was silent. He did not step forward as many men might have, nor offer empty words of comfort. He simply stood there, with a respectful air of distance, as if he understood that a troubled heart needed not loud words, but a non-intrusive presence. After a moment he spoke in a slow, steady voice, the voice of someone who had learned to speak just enough. "If so, borrow my strength, just until you find your own strength again." The words were so simple that they made Mara's nose sting. They didn't promise anything grand, nor did they embellish sacrifice. Just a genuine act of kindness, what the elders called old kindness, kindness that didn't need to be shown. And that is what warms the hearts of those who hear the story later. James did not try to save Mara. He just held out his hand, waiting for her to have the courage to take it. To understand the gravity of the moment, we must return to the context of Ash Hollow. In a town accustomed to viewing women as appendages to the law, the presence of a man who listens, who keeps a respectful distance, is almost a rarity beyond the windy hills. It is like a small lamp lit in a dark room. It doesn't change everything, but it makes the darkness less frightening. James began by explaining to Mara why he was there. Walter Carlin had heard about Owen's will, and he suspected Barnett Price had interfered. Carlin had never liked Barnett, but what worried him most was the handwriting, and handwriting was not easy to fake in the eyes of someone who had been signing bills of sale for decades. James told just enough, without adding rumors, without stretching the truth. His manner gave the impression that what he said was true. That simplicity, a very American, very frontier trait, gave him a kind of quiet authority, making the older people sense that this was not the type to influence others. He just told the truth, and let the truth stand. As Mara listened, something strange happened. Her fear did not go away, but it did feel less lonely. It was like when winter is about to fall, and someone lights a small fire. It does not chase away the cold, but it reminds you that warmth still exists somewhere. Narratively, James's appearance is a subtle first light of sorts, a common feature in frontier heart stories. Here, the man is not a knight on a white horse coming to save, but a wounded soul trying to find a way to live kindly amidst harsh conditions. As such, his presence is very emotionally evocative to older audiences who appreciate the value of sincerity through small actions rather than flowery words. After hearing James's story, Mara leaned her hands on the edge of the table to keep her balance. Part of her still didn't believe in any light. It had been dark for too long. But another part, the weakest but bravest part of her soul, realized that life had just opened up a small path, bumpy but definitely there. James, perhaps sensing that, nodded slightly. "You don't have to decide anything right away. Just know that you don't have to stand alone." His respect for Mara's choices is what makes it all the more touching. Older audiences understand sometimes the kindest thing someone can do is not to make decisions for us, but to let us stand up for ourselves, but not alone. The afternoon light was fading. On the main street, a few curious people glanced into the shop, trying to guess who the stranger was. Ash Hollow was a small town and news traveled fast. But James was unfazed, nor did he avoid anyone's gaze. He just waited patiently for Mara to calm down, as if time were of no importance to a desperate man to breathe properly again. And when Mara thanks him, her voice small but clear like a bell, striking metal in the dead of night, fragile but with will, the audience understands that a turning point has been laid. Not a turning point of rescue, but of a return of faith, even if only a very small piece. Faith on the border always starts with small things like that. And from the moment James let the shop door close behind him, Mara felt maybe there was still a way out of her life. Small, fragile, but so real that one dared not ignore it. That afternoon, the light through the windows of Ellsworth and Sons gradually turned a deep yellow, like the color of the pages of an old book. Mara and James's shadows stretched across the counter like two parallel lines about to intersect at an unexpected point. In the silence, Mara knew it was time to hear the hard things, and to say the things she never thought she would. James sat down on a chair near the shelf, took off his leather gloves, and placed them on the table as a way of reassuring her. He did not bring force, only frankness. His voice was low and reserved, as if afraid of confusing Mara further. "Since Timberline Ridge, I've heard a lot about Barnett Price. He doesn't just want to marry you. He wants control of all the land along the Copperbend River. And your trading post is at the center of that trade route." The words did not surprise Mara. In Ash Hollow, power often hid in the ugliest wooden buildings, and grand schemes were often cloaked in the voices of the most honorable men. But what sent a chill down her spine was when James continued slowly, as if he were weighing every word. "I fear this forced marriage is just the tip of the iceberg. Barnett has already forced several households to lose their land under the pretext of tax arrears. No one dares to resist because his patrol force is larger, bolder, and has the favor of the town law." Until now, Mara had thought she was being forced into this because she wanted to keep the trading post for the Ellsworth family. But now she understood that the story extended far beyond her own home. It was a game of power. And she, a widow, was just a pawn to be used. The realization made Mara's lips dry. But instead of collapsing, she felt a part of her, a quiet but persistent part, start to straighten. James opened the leather bag beside him and took out the crumpled map Carlin had sent. Marks circled in red ink stretched along the trail leading out of Ash Hollow. If Barnett had sent out patrols, they would have blocked the north and the river routes. Those two were too predictable. The only way that might have a chance, he pointed to the rugged hills to the east, was the rocky slope of Willow Crag. It was difficult, but no one would have expected a widow to choose the most dangerous route to escape. Mara looked at the map for a long time. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her eyes were no longer afraid. There was one thing James did not say, but Mara understood this escape plan threatened not only her life, but also his. The man who had just helped a stranger out of nothing but kindness. And then, what moved the audience, especially the older audience, the most, was the moment Mara placed her hand on the map as if taking responsibility for her life once again. "I will go," she said, not raising her voice, not trembling, just a simple, solemn affirmation. "But I will not leave Ash Hollow empty-handed. I must bring with me proof that Owen never gave this shop to anyone else." She stood and walked into the back room where Owen had recorded every bill, every shipment, every single expense. Mara opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a thick, frayed brown leather notebook. Owen's handwriting covered every page, neat, deliberate, filled with the mind of an honest businessman. This book was more than an account book. It was her husband's life, a testament to the kindness he left behind. And most importantly, the signature in the book is completely different from the signature in the will. When Mara handed the book to James, he took it with both hands, as if it were a sacred object. There was something quiet in his eyes, an emotion that was hard to name but enough to let one know that he respected Mara's decision and the past she was trying to protect. Analyzing on a deeper level of meaning, this is the moment that marks the change in the female character's role. From being passively subjected to social pressure, Mara becomes the one who actively guides her own destiny. This is in line with the taste of older audiences, those who appreciate the wisdom, self-respect, and ability of women to stand up for themselves, especially in a harsh historical context. James looked at Mara as if he saw something shining within her. Not physical beauty, but intelligence and dignity, the kind of light that only the wounded soul could see in another. "If you have this book with you," said James, "then the plan will have to change a little. We can't just run away. We have to make them believe you're not carrying anything of value. Otherwise, Barnett will come after you." A moment of silence passed, like the sound of wind whistling through the door. Finally, Mara nodded. "Then we have to distract them." James just smiled slightly. The quiet smile of the Westerners, both encouragement and a silent promise that he would be there when times were tough. They sat together for over an hour, mapping out each step. Who will be the horse carriage driver to fool the patrol force? Where will abandoned horse change road? Burn some fake signs on the ground to mislead. And time to leave Ash Hollow before Barnett ordered the siege tightened. Mara listened to every word, not retreating, not hesitating. For older viewers, this was a moment that proved that pain can silence someone, but dignity never dies. As the last light of day faded behind the window, Mara closed the notebook, clutching it to her chest as if holding a piece of her heart. James stood up and put his hat back on. He looked at Mara for a long time before saying, "We'll only get one chance. But you don't have to go through it alone. I'll be there until you stand on your own 2 feet." Those words, not overly emotional, not promising the future, but containing trust, something that made the listener's heart sink, and perhaps made Mara know for the first time what it was like to hope without asking for anything in return. Outside, the wind picked up. Ash Hollow began to light up, and in that moment a plan to escape and a plan to regain dignity was born. And as night fell on Ash Hollow that night, with the wind howling down the main street and the oil lamps flickering like the faint breath of an old spirit, Mara had no idea that her first trial was closer than she had imagined. So close, in fact, that the unexpected knock on her door shook what she had just mustered into hope. The next morning, Ash Hollow was strangely quiet. Usually mornings were filled with the sounds of carts, children running along the streets, men hauling wood from the pastures. But that day there was an invisible thread tying everything to silence. Mara sensed the change as soon as she opened the shop. The mist still lingered on the glass, as thin as the breath of someone trying to stay calm. And at that moment, a figure appeared at the end of the street. Tall, dark, in a long coat, walking with the confidence of someone used to holding the power of life and death in his hands. Barnett Price. No one had to look closely to know it was him. To the people of Ash Hollow, the way he walked spoke volumes: arrogance, control, and a belief that every door would open when he knocked. Mara stood still, her hands on the counter. Her heart beat slowly but deeply, as if each beat was laced with fear. Whatever plans she and James had made last night had not prepared her for Barnett to arrive so early. He opened the door slowly, deliberately, as if to demonstrate that other people's fear was a light he could turn on or off at will. "Good morning, Mrs. Ellsworth," Barnett said, her voice smooth and chilling. Without waiting for her reply, he walked in, looking around the shop as if it had long been his property. His eyes were cold, not the cold of someone who had suffered much, but the coldness of limitless ambition. "I came to bring you good news," Barnett continued. "Our wedding will be held at the church this weekend. The whole town will be there. I want everyone to see the Ellsworths return to stability." The two words stability were spoken slowly and emphasized by him like a dull knife cutting through stone. Mara felt a tightness in her spine. He had run out of time. Pressure rippled like an undertow. What had Barnett in such a hurry? Why was he suddenly acting as if he feared losing something? James stood behind the shelf, slightly out of Barnett's sight. He had come early to check the escape route, but now he had to stand still. His eyes sharpened not with anger, but with the realization that the plan was unraveling in ways they hadn't anticipated. Barnett took a step forward, looking at Mara for a long time, too long as if to impress upon her that the choice was his. "I know you're under a lot of pressure," he said, feigning sympathy, "but believe me, this is the best way to preserve Owen's honor and your own." The words, "Owen's honor," made Mara feel as if someone had doused her with cold water. For there was something in Barnett's eyes, a coldness deeper than the cold of the frontier morning. The look not of someone visiting a widow, but of someone hiding something darker. In that moment, a thought flashed through her mind, thin but sharp as a needle. Had Owen really died of illness, or had someone, the one standing before her, done something worse? Mara clenched her fists on the counter. Barnett didn't know she was watching him, but the unusual look was enough to stir a premonition in her heart. Many older audiences will understand this. There are truths that don't need to be said. They lie in a look, a breath, an unreasonable rush. As Barnett left, he did not forget to turn back once more, as if wanting to leave a final mark. "Get ready for the wedding, Mrs. Ellsworth. I don't want any delays." He closed the door and stepped outside, and Mara heard his boots echo on the wooden walkway, heavy, steady like the war drumbeat of a threat. The door just closed. James stepped out, his face as tense as a guitar string. "He knows something," James said quietly. "Not just about you. He knows someone is helping you." Mara looked down at her hands. They were still shaking, but this time it wasn't just from fear. There was anger in the shaking, and a doubt about Owen's death that she had never dared to consider. "James," she whispered. "I saw something in his eyes. As if he didn't miss Owen as much as he said he did." James was silent. No one on the border would say such a thing so lightly, for accusing someone of murder could spell the end of your life. But sometimes the intuition of the bereaved is sharper than a well-sharpened knife. "If that's true," James said softly, "we must leave Ash Hollow before he can close the circle." Mara's gaze turned to the street. Barnett was riding toward the town hall. The wind blew his coat, revealing the heavy gun at his side, the symbol of Ash Hollow's power. Suddenly, a thought pierced Mara's heart. If he can force a widow to marry, what else can he do? That question, like darkness falling, made everything in her heart more serious than any escape plan. Narratively, this sequence opens up a turn of doubt, something Frontier Hearts often uses to send its characters on a journey to confront the truth. Older audiences are particularly sensitive to the implications of morality, of people not being what they seem, and of the responsibility of those left behind with unspoken secrets. In this case, Barnett's gaze was the catalyst. It makes the escape plan more than just escaping a forced marriage, but to run from a hand that could have taken Owen's life. From here, Mara's tragedy goes beyond being forced into marriage. It carries the depth of a larger question: is the truth buried in the very town she has called home for so many years? James looked at Mara, his eyes softening as he saw the determination forming in her. Not the determination of someone running away, but of someone defending the honor of the dead. "We must act faster," said James. "Tonight, not in 3 days." Mara nodded. She knew she wouldn't turn back. 2 things had already dawned on her in her heart: fear of what Barnett might do, and the truth she must find for Owen, no matter how painful. That night, as Barnett left Main Street, Ash Hollow fell into a silence heavier than any winter evening. It was as if the whole town knew something was stirring beneath the dust, something only a few brave enough to name, and it was in that silence that Mara and James's escape plan began to take its first steps. The wind blew through the poplars behind Ellsworth and Sons, carrying with it the damp scent of old earth and hay. The moon was dim, silvery, bright enough to see, but not bright enough to be noticeable. If ever there was a night for a silent farewell, this was it. Mara locked the shop door behind her. The click of the lock was small, but enough to make her heart clench. That wooden door had once opened so many stories of life, smiles, greetings, pieces of love that she and Owen had built with their hard-working hands. Now it became the final boundary between a familiar life and a journey no one dared to predict. James waited behind, near the small garden Owen had tended. His figure blended into the darkness, only his eyes lit up in the night, looking at Mara without urging, without hurrying, but with the patience of someone who understands that some steps need to be taken slowly so that the heart can carry what is important. "Mara, we have to go," James said, his voice as deep as the breath of the earth. She nodded. They headed for the back garden, where a low wooden fence allowed them to leave the house unseen from the main street. But as soon as they got there, Mara heard unfamiliar footsteps. A man stood at the end of the garden in front of the stable door, silent but alert. She recognized him, Silas Crow, Barnett's closest henchman. The townspeople used to say that Silas could smell trouble from afar, and that his silence was more terrifying than the shouts of many violent men. Mara's heart pounded. Silas was checking the horse tracks, probably in preparation for a new patrol. If he spotted them now, everything would fall apart in an instant. James placed a hand gently on Mara's shoulder, signaling her to stay still. Then he bent down and picked up a round stone just heavy enough. He looked at Silas for a moment, not with panic but with the quiet calculation of someone who had been through far more danger. James took a few steps to the left, found the right angle of wind, and threw the stone as hard as he could into the bushes some distance away. The sound was sharp and decisive. Silas turned at once, drew his dagger, and strode toward the sound. He walked away, disappearing down the path that led to the back garden. James let out a soft breath, a sigh that Mara heard like wind through the buttresses of the cliff. "Let's go," he said, faster this time. They crossed the small space behind the house and headed for the carriage James had hidden under the shade of a large birch tree. The 2 dark brown horses stood strangely still, as if they too understood that silence was the only key to the night. James helped Mara into the carriage, then pulled his cloak over her shoulders to ward off the night dew. There were no extra words exchanged between them. Just a light, respectful moment, warm enough for the audience to feel like a small ember in a winter fireplace. As James climbed into the front seat and took the reins, a sudden noise made Mara turn. She looked toward her house, the window still lit by the oil lamp she had forgotten to turn off, The light was like a wave from the past, something holding her back. And Mara wasn't strong enough not to look back. She turned back to the cabin, her eyes welling up. Not tears, just a mist covering her eyelids. Something anyone who has suffered loss knows sadness doesn't have to come in drops to make your heart clench. "Goodbye, Owen," she whispered. No one heard but herself and the gray sky above. James, without turning back, still said in a voice as light as the wind, "It's okay, Mara. Sometimes you have to let go to keep the best of the past. Not to forget, but to remember properly." That sentence, with its slow and quiet rhythm, carries the true spirit of humane Western stories. Few words, but so profound that older audiences can feel like they are hearing their own lives respond. James jerked the reins gently. The carriage moved on. The wheels rolled across the dry ground, kicking up a cloud of red dust. The dust swirled behind them, covering the path like a curtain, hiding them from what was to come. Ash Hollow Main Street receded behind them. The little wooden house faded into a blur. Memories clung to every window, every grain of wood, as if waving a hand. Mara felt her heart being pulled back, but her body being pulled forward. The feeling made her eyes sting once more. It wasn't pain, but acceptance that a chapter had closed. From an analytical perspective, this is a quintessential cinematic Western moment. Red dust, carriage wheel rolling. The woman looked back at the roof one last time. The darkness ahead, no one knows. Silence contains both fear and hope. That is the spirit of frontier hearts, not chasing tragedy but following the journey of the soul. As the wagon left town, the wind picked up. The houses fell back like silent witnesses to a secret that would be whispered all over the town by morning. James kept a firm grip on the reins, but his eyes occasionally glanced toward the woods to the east, where they would hide until daylight. Mara clutched the ledger tightly to her chest. She could feel its edges through the fabric of her shirt. It felt like she held a piece of Owen's soul, and a piece of the truth she needed to find. In that moment, a silent movement happened inside her. She was no longer a woman on the run. She was becoming a woman searching for answers. James said softly without turning back, "From here on things will be more difficult." Mara replied softly, "I know. But I'm not as scared as before." The wind stirred up another cloud of red dust. The wagon rolled on, taking them farther away from Ash Hollow, the grim town where they had been forced to lay down their first burden of the journey. And when the torchlight flared behind them that night, a light as urgent and impatient as the fierce wind across Ash Hollow, Mara knew this was no escape. This was real pursuit, the moment when fate stopped keeping its distance and began to offer real challenges. The wagon wheels rolled faster as James jerked the reins. The main road out of Ash Hollow was a blur of dust behind them, but the sounds followed like drumbeats, the pounding of hooves, the shouts of Barnett's patrol. These men were not merely working, they were hunting, as if empowered to erase any trace of displeasure from their master. Mara sat in the car, clutching the notebook tightly to her chest. She didn't look back. She knew that looking back would only make her heart sink, and tonight, any delay could cost her her life. James turned off the main road before the patrol caught up. They entered the trail that led up the Granite Vale Mountains, a line of dark, steep rocks that towered like ancient walls. The road was difficult and treacherous, and only those accustomed to the harsh West knew how to navigate it. The wind was colder up high. The sky seemed low, crossed by gray rocks that sliced the moonlight into tiny pieces. "Mara, hold on," James said softly, his voice mixed with the horse's heavy breathing. His eyes were fixed ahead, tense and focused. He knew they didn't have much time. A few minutes later, the sound of hooves behind them grew louder. One of the men recognized James's distinctive hoof prints, the arrowheads used by the blacksmiths at Timberline Ridge. "They're on your trail," Mara whispered, her voice lost in the wind. James clenched his jaw. He had known it all along, and so he was forced to do what few would have thought possible, take them into the rocky terrain to cut the trail. But James himself had never tried that road at night. He drove into the narrow gorge where the rocks stood steeply on both sides. Behind him, Silas Crow shouted orders. "Block the south entrance. His horse has the marked timberline. Don't let him get lost." Mara's heart clenched. This was no longer a flight. This was a chase. James suddenly pulled the horse down a steep slope of rubble that could barely be called a road. The wheels skidded. Mara was thrown forward by momentum. Just as they passed a large rock, gunshots rang out. One shot, then another. Mara heard the bullets hit the rocks, sending small sparks flying in the darkness. And then, a strangled groan came from right next to her. James leaned forward slightly, his hand holding the reins, shaking once before tightening. "James." Mara cried out in the wind. A dark stain of blood appeared on the side of his shirt. "Just a graze." His voice dropped, but he still tried to keep his composure. "Hold on tight to the side of the car. I can still control it." But Mara knew he was holding on, and knew that, in just a minute or two, if he fell out of the driver's seat, it would all be over. The road ahead narrowed into a steep cliff. It was impossible to continue by car. James turned to face Mara, his eyes sharper than the moonlight falling on the rocks. "Leave the car. Walk across the narrow path. Do you hear me? You're hurt," Mara blurted out, her voice trembling and firm. "I can still walk, but the car can't," he replied. He took a deep breath, then spoke in a slow voice, the voice of someone entrusting his life to the calm of another. "From here on, you will have to be the guide." The words fell like a resounding drumbeat, not because James was weak, but because he believed Mara could do things she never thought possible. It's a moment that older audiences will be deeply moved by. A woman pushed to the brink suddenly becomes strong in the quietest way. No screaming, no showing off. Just doing what needs to be done. Mara got out first and circled around to the side of the car. James tried to jump down but slipped slightly because of his injury. Mara caught him despite his weight, and her strength was low. "Lean on me," she said, her voice so calm that James had to look at her again. As darkness closed around her, Mara touched the wound in his side. Warm blood soaked into her sleeve. But she did not tremble, not fear, only focus. She tore off a piece of his inner shirt, tied it tightly around his waist, and checked his wound as she had learned from Owen when he gave first aid to injured freighters. James looked at her with a rare look of surprise. "Mara, you did well." She didn't answer, just nodded slightly. Then she put her arm around his waist. "We have to get over the cliff. Then find a dark crevice big enough to hide the car. If they see your car, they'll know we didn't go far." James smiled tiredly but sincerely. "You're thinking like a frontiersman, Mara. That compliment is not to beautify the story. It is the truth." They helped each other over the sheer cliffs where the ground was cracked like old mountain scars. Every step was difficult, not because of the distance, but because the sound of hooves behind them was getting closer. Mara found a deep crevice between two giant boulders, big enough to drive the car through, dark enough to hide his tracks. She led the horses in, first stroking their necks reassuringly. Then she turned back to James, pulling him into the darkness. A sudden gust of wind blew down. The granite veil seemed to close its mouth, hiding them from the approaching torches. In that moment where darkness enveloped them both and the sound of pursuit echoed down from the top of the slope, Mara felt her heart change. No longer just a woman on the run. No longer just a widow trying to save her honor. She was becoming the one standing between danger, holding the lives of both. She realized that sometimes fear doesn't go away. It just gives way to determination when someone else needs you. James leaned against the cliff, wincing in pain but still conscious. He spoke in a ragged breath but with a slight smile. "I told you, you just need to borrow my strength until you find your own. And now," he looked at Mara, "you've found it." Mara said nothing, but her eyes wet, but tearless answered. The torches swept across the crevice of the rock for a long time, then faded and disappeared. Granite Vale returned to darkness, and the two peoples labored breathing. And in the midst of that scene, wild, dangerous, but strangely real, something new was emerging. Not hope, but a bond. The kind of bond that only forms when people share their fears and courage in the same heartbeat. And as the night on Granite Vale gradually dissipated into thin sheets of mist, leaving only the sound of the wind through the crevices of the rocks and the breathing of the two people taking shelter in the heart of the mountain, Mara understood that there are moments when time slows down, not because of peace, but because the heart begins to realize who is truly by your side. Dawn was slow on the Granite Vale, the light filtering through the cliffs like silver threads. Mara sat beside James, who still leaned against the large rock. His wound was bandaged, but his breathing was still heavy like the crunch of dirt under horse hooves at night. As the first light touched his face, Mara noticed that the man from the Wild West's tanned skin was paler, but his eyes were still bright, still reassuringly steady. "We have to get out of here before they come back," Mara said, her voice low but firm. James looked at her, his eyes slowly as if weighing every emotion. "You did a great job last night. I just did what had to be done," Mara replied. James smiled slightly, a rare smile as quiet as the sound of running water in the distance. Sometimes the necessary things are the bravest things to do. They followed the stone path down the north slope. The path took them to a place Carlin had reminded James of, the Willow Bend River, which wound along the foot of the mountain like a silver ribbon. As they approached, the sound of the water carried a gentleness Mara hadn't heard since leaving Ash Hollow. This was the first time in many days of running that she felt like she could breathe. Mara walked back to the riverbank. The water was so clear, you could see the stones at the bottom, smooth and round like keepsakes from nature preserved from generation to generation. She bent down and let her hand touch the cold water, cold enough to revive a soul hardened by fear and loss. James stood a few feet away. He didn't approach. He didn't push. He didn't intrude on her moment. He understood instinctively, like men in the Old West, that there were some wounds that could only be healed with space, and respect was the most exquisite gift one could give. Mara closed her eyes, let the water flow through her fingers, listened to a sound she had long forgotten, the sound of life that did not threaten, did not pursue, simply flow. As the sun rose higher, they found a small hollow at the foot of the mountain to rest. James gathered some dry branches and started a fire. The flames flickered, casting orange shadows on his face, highlighting the wound in his side. Mara saw him wince slightly as he looked down. "Don't try," she said. James smiled faintly. "It's just a little pain. I can bear the pain. But the cold, I can't." That slight joke made Mara laugh, for the first time, small, thin, but enough to soften James's eyes. They sat by the fire, drinking some water and eating some of the crackers James had brought from Timberline Ridge. The fire made the space feel like a quiet underground room. After a moment, Mara spoke slowly, as if reopening an old chest full of memories. "I first met Owen at the winter market. It was snowing so hard I thought I would lose my way home. He took me home, that was all. He didn't say much. But I remember how steady his hands were on the reins." Mara's voice paused. There was no pain, just an old wound speaking under the layers of memory. "After that he always did everything gently without overdoing it. I think what makes people love someone sometimes is just quiet things like that." James didn't interrupt. He let her speak like a lamp holder, not letting the wind go out, but not forcing the light. After a while, Mara asked softly, "And you? Has anyone ever stayed in your life?" James looked into the fire, the light reflecting off his eyes, making them deeper, more profound. "Yes," he said, "a woman from Dead River. I met her while I was working at the shipping station. She was very sick, and I didn't get her to the infirmary in time." He paused, not because of hesitation but because sometimes nostalgia needs silence to fall by itself. "I think people still believe that all cowboys are strong. But I was weak when I needed to be the strongest," Mara said softly. "You're not a god, James. You're human, and sometimes humans have to be like that." James turned to look at her. His eyes weren't looking for forgiveness but understanding. A breeze blew across the grass, swaying the flames. Mara bent down, touched the wound in James's side, and checked the knot. "You risked your life for me," she said, her voice as deep as Willow Bend. "For someone you only knew one night on the cobblestones." "Mara," James said softly. "Why did you do that?" James looked at her for a long time, as if choosing each word so as not to burden the other person. "Because sometimes the soul realizes things that reason has not yet understood." Those words were so light yet so deep that Mara felt her heart tighten, not from pain, but from the vibration of a heart that had not been touched by true kindness for too long. Mara still had her hand on his side. James reached up and gently touched her hand, not squeezing, not holding, just a gentle presence. They looked at each other in silence, silence like a frozen frame of film, silence as if time had stopped to listen to their heartbeats. And then, like a slow breath of wind, they leaned towards each other. The first kiss came not in a hurry, not explosively. It was like the early winter sunlight touching a wooden window light, warm and enough to let one know that winter would eventually have to give way to gentler things. A kiss of hearts that were once wounded, but still dared to find their way back to each other. When they parted, Mara gently placed her hand on James's chest, feeling the still rapid heartbeat. James said, his voice hoarse but warm, "From here on there will be many dangers." "I know," Mara replied, "but I am not going alone anymore." James's face, softened at it, was rare for a man like him to show emotion, but this moment he had no need to hide it. And as the first rays of morning sun crept over the distant pines, and the warmth of last night's kiss lingered somewhere in the silence, Mara understood that her and James's journey was no longer just an escape. It was a search for truth, for justice, and for the things the dead had never had a chance to say. The road from Willowbend to Hartford was longer than Mara had expected, but also more peaceful than she had expected. The dirt road wound through fields of barley that stretched to the horizon, the simple wooden houses scattered like old chairs placed in the right place in a silent room. Hartford was not as noisy as Ash Hollow, nor was it as harsh. It seemed like a town where people grew old slowly, where every movement carried the breath of a gentle life. James tied the reins, then turned to look at Mara. "This place will be safe for a while." "And Mr. Carlin is here?" Mara asked. James nodded. "He said he had something to give you. Something Owen left behind that never reached you." The sentence made Mara pause, as if someone had just placed a hand on the shoulder of her memory. Walter Carlin's house was on the edge of town, a low house with a gray tiled roof surrounded by rows of early carrots and a few wild rose bushes. When Mara entered, Carlin was sitting at the table, his large hands still calloused from a lifetime of moving goods. He looked up, his eyes dim with age but still filled with the warmth Mara had grown accustomed to years ago. "Mara Ellsworth, you're finally here." His voice trembled slightly, as if carrying an unspoken regret. Mara sat down. James stood behind silently like a solid support. Carlin looked at her, his eyes becoming more serious. "Before Owen died, he said he was being followed." "Followed?" Mara repeated, her voice not too loud but enough for the small room to hear the shock in it. Carlin nodded slowly. "He said there were people hanging around the trading post, asking about shipments, about sales, about land along the Copper Bend. He said there was something wrong with the man he once called a friend." Mara tugged lightly at the hem of her shirt. "Are you talking about Barnett Price, mister?" Carlin exhaled a heavy sigh like old wood creaking under the floorboards. Owen didn't want to name names. But who in Ash Hollow didn't know Barnett was the only one powerful enough and greedy enough to do it? The room fell silent, except for the steady swing of the pendulum clock, as if to remind them that the truth must eventually come out. Carlin reached into an old drawer, took out a small wooden box, and placed it in front of Mara. "This is what Owen gave me, saying if anything happened, to give it to you. He kept insisting that time was running out." Mara opened the lid of the box. Inside, a letter folded in half, the paper yellowed, Owen's handwriting soft, slanted, and so familiar it made her chest ache. She opened the letter, her hand shaking slightly. In it, Owen wrote of his suspicions. Some people wanted the Ellsworth trading post to fail so they could gain control of the freight line. A draft will was proposed to be signed while he was unconscious after a sudden illness. And most importantly, Mara, if you are reading this letter, it means that what you fear most may have happened. Mara put her hand to her mouth. The room spun slightly around her. James stepped forward, placing his hand on Mara's shoulder, saying nothing, just letting his presence serve as support. Carlin continued, his voice so slow it almost touched the stones beneath their feet. Owen also said that, if he did not survive, there was only one person who could intervene in his illness, a person who wanted his trading post to be in his hands. No one needed to say his name. Barnett Price appeared in Mara's mind as clearly as a shadow caught in a firelight. After a long while, Mara asked, his voice hoarse, like the sound of wind through a chimney. "Why didn't you give me this letter in the first place?" Carlin bowed his head. "Because I was afraid, Mara. Barnett had too much power in Ash Hollow. I didn't want you dragged into danger." He paused, his eyes filling with tears. "But now, You're caught up. And this is the only thing I can do for you. And for Owen." Mara stared at the letter for a long time. The familiar handwriting carried a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. But then, with the deepest sigh of her life, she said, "I have to know what really happened to Owen." James looked into her eyes, his gaze like an unspoken promise. "And I will go with you to the end." The small room felt warm, not from the fireplace, but from the solidarity of those who still believed that justice, however circuitous, would find a way to prevail. In terms of narrative art, this segment marks an important turning point. The escape officially becomes a journey to find the truth. The Barnett threat emerges with a more complex motive, not only occupying land and trading posts, but also possibly interfering in Owen's death. Mara goes from being a fugitive to now standing in the position of a justice seeker, with courage nourished by both love and pain. For older audiences, this emotional depth touches on values they hold dear: dignity, loyalty, and truth must be returned to its rightful place. As Mara stood up to leave Hartford, she took a deep breath. The wind blew through the wild rose garden, the smell of fresh earth and dried flowers reminding her of Ash Hollow in a different way, not as a place she had fled, but as a place she would return to, someday, not to endure, but to reclaim what was hers and Owen's. And as Mara walked out of Walter Carlin's old house, Owen's letter shivering in the Hartford wind, she understood that the truth wasn't just meant to hurt, it was meant to guide. But to have the strength to return to Ash Hollow someday, she had to stand firm. First stand firm, with a new life, with her own two hands. Hartford in the afternoon had a peace that Ash Hollow had never known. The red dirt roads were bathed in the late afternoon sunlight, as soft as old linen. Occasionally the church bells rang out, falling on the wooden roofs, as a reminder that life, though stormy, still had gentle pauses. Mara sat on the bench, in front of the small tea shop. Owen's letter was still in her hand, and the warmth of her conversation with Carlin lingered there like a lingering breeze. James sat beside her, keeping just the right distance, too close to intrude on her thoughts, not too far away to make her feel alone. That was his way, quiet, but always there. After a long while, Mara said, her voice as soft as falling leaves, "I can't keep running away, James. One day, I have to return to Ash Hollow to bring Owen's truth to light." James looked straight ahead where the sunset was slowly touching the hilltops. "I know. But before you go back, you need a place to stand. A future to lean on, not just a pain to look back on." Mara listened, and she knew he was right. Grief could not be the only thing that guided a life. During her brief stay in Hartford, Mara begins to think beyond pain and loss. In this peaceful town, she discovers what her busy life in Ellsworth trading post had previously denied her: a desire to be a creator of beauty. Since childhood, Mara loved to look at the delicately sewn hats in the stalls at Moonridge, loved the way the ribbons were arranged into flower shapes, loved the way the skillful stitches could support the soft, sad faces of Western women. But in Ash Hollow, that was just a secret hobby, a dream too far away to reach. At Hartford, that dream takes real form. One morning, while walking along the market street, Mara saw a small tailor shop with a wooden sign that read, "Madame Renford, Millinery and Dressmaking." Inside were rolls of cream-colored fabric, unadorned hats, and wooden frames for dresses. The smell of linen, new thread, a life woven of patience, it all warmed her heart in a strange way. Madame Renforda, silver-haired woman with eyes as gentle but sharp as a winter stream, looked at Mara for a moment and said, "You have the hands of a craftsman. I can tell by the way you feel the edge of the cloth." Mara pursed her lips slightly. "I'm not sure I'm skilled enough." "No one starts out sure, my dear." Renford smiled. "But I can teach you if you're willing to learn." And so, for the first time, in a long journey filled with fear and loss, Mara chose a new direction, not to forget Owen, but to continue the part of his life he had not yet completed. While Mara learned her first stitches, James had his own journey, spending afternoons talking to landmen outside Hartford, learning about the land to the northeast, a place Carlin had mentioned, Lakeshore Bay. It was a rare coastal region of the northern steppe where the sea lapped against the grasslands in waves as soft as an old quilt. Few big towns, few people, few conflicts, far enough to give every wound time to heal. James returned to the tailor shop one afternoon while Mara was learning how to attach lace to a small hat. He stood in the doorway, his hands in his coat pockets. "We found a place." Mara looked up. The late afternoon sunlight caught James's dark blue eyes, making them look both steady and peaceful. "Where is that Lakeshore Bay?" he replied. "A quiet place with soft, farmable soil. There's a long beach, and the wind isn't too cold in the winter. They say people who want to start a new life often go there." Mara listened, and a feeling that was hard to name arose in her heart. It was not joy, nor was it worry. It was the feeling one gets when standing in front of a new door, knowing that behind it would be a whole world where one could live again, no longer a shadow of pain. That evening Mara sat by the window of her room looking out onto Hartford Street. Below, the oil lamps from the shops along the street cast a golden glow on the ground, creating a space as warm as someone's palm holding the light. James entered so softly that the wooden floor did not creak. "Have you decided yet?" he asked. Mara looked down at Owen's letter which lay on her lap. After a long moment she said, "Owen wants me to live. Not live in hiding, but live as myself." She turned her eyes calmer than they had been in days. "And I want to learn to sew properly. I want to build something for myself, with my own hands." James nodded, a warmth spreading across his face. "Lakeshore Bay will give you that opportunity. We can build a small house. I can work with the construction crew there. And you can open a shop like this, or bigger if you want." Mara chuckled. "A tailor shop by the sea. Sounds like something out of the ordinary." James shrugged slightly. In places where people find themselves, the unreal often becomes the most real. Mara looked at him for a long time, and for the first time since leaving Ash Hollow, she no longer feared the future, seeing only a wide open space where she could start again, not to hide the pain but to nurture hope. Artistically, this is a rebirth arc. Older audiences see themselves in this journey, a woman rising from loss, learning a new trade, building a new life with work and dignity. James doesn't have to save her. He's just a shade beside her, a kind presence that's typical of an Old West man, quiet, steady, and respectful. Both do not enter love through dependence, but through parallel maturity. The day they left Hartford, the sky was unusually clear. The wind from the east carried a faint scent of salt, a sign that they were approaching Lakeshore Bay. Mara looked back at the town street one last time, shedding no tears, feeling as light as the cloth cap she held in her hands. She did not leave the past behind. She carried it with her but did not let it hold her back. James brought the horse. "Ready, Mara," she nodded. "This time, I go for myself." And as the road to Lakeshore Bay unfolds like a new page, the days spent with James, quiet yet warm, help Mara realize that sometimes God doesn't take everything away from people. He leaves behind small lights to guide them toward peace. As for the heart, it just takes courage to open the door to the light. The journey to Lakeshore Bay was longer than Mara and James had anticipated, but instead of being tiring, it felt like a long break from life for those who had suffered too much loss. The endless fields, the rows of weeping willows along the road, the faint sound of the ocean waves echoing in the distance. All of it created a wordless music, enough to make people breathe more slowly, think more deeply. The sun was already slanting toward the end of the day when they reached the Whitford farm. It was where Owen's old friends the Whitfordshads lived before moving north. The farm was now deserted save for the large orange grove behind it, its oranges still swaying in the wind as if time had forgotten to take them. James unloaded his luggage from the car and returned. He kept his usual distance, no too close, but enough for Mara to feel his presence clearly. "Let's stay here for the night and continue tomorrow morning," he said. Mara looked around. The sky was purple, the wind blew through the orange trees, carrying a sweet and sour scent that made her heart lighten a beat. "This place is so peaceful," she said softly. "It's quieter than I remember," James replied, looking out at the swaying trees. They built a fire under the old porch. James set up a blanket for Mara and spread another on the steps. The moon rose high in the night sky, bright as still water. After eating some dry bread and drinking some water, Mara stood up and walked out into the orange grove. The oranges were round and bright, like small oil lamps. Each step made the leaves shake slightly, making a soft sound like old paper. James followed slowly without making a sound. Mara stood in the middle of the garden under the full moon hanging overhead. "James, if we set foot in Lakeshore Bay tomorrow, everything would be different. I would have to start over, really start over." James stood a few feet away from her. The moonlight made his face look like it was carved from stone, calm, steady. Mara, every day in her future would not have to be as strenuous as the past. He took a deep breath, then spoke slowly, so slowly that Mara felt each word fall into her heart, like early summer raindrops. "And you don't have to go alone." Mara turned back. James's eyes, the color of mountain rocks, after the rain no longer hid anything. There was no imposition, no expectation, just the sincerity of a Western man who understood the value of a promise. He stepped closer. Not in a hurry, not making her step back. From his coat pocket, James took out a small walnut box. He opened it. Inside was a plain silver ring with a small, pale blue stone. Mara looked, her breath hitching. James said, his voice deep and warm like underground water in the heart of the mountain, "This is my mother's ring. She left it to me with the instruction, give it to the person you want to walk with, not the person you want to save." He looked up and met Mara's eyes. "I don't want to save you, Mara." He paused for half a second, not out of hesitation, but because he wanted the words to reach her heart fully. "I just want to walk beside you in the days that God still gives us." The air in the orange garden seemed to freeze. The wind stopped too. Only the heartbeats of two people who had suffered together could be heard. Mara raised a hand to her chest. She didn't cry, no tears fell, not in drops. But her eyes were moist in the way of those who have lived long enough to know that true happiness comes not in storms, but in soft light through curtains on a calm morning. "James, I don't know if I deserve this," she whispered. James took a step forward, the distance now only a breath away. "None of us came into each other's lives as completely worthy." He gently took her hand. "We chose each other. And that is enough." Mara looked down at the ring again. It didn't sparkle like the jewels of the big city. It was simple like the life she'd longed for, honest, unadorned, asking nothing but kindness and patience. "James." Her voice trembled slightly, not with fear, but with emotion. "I agree." James didn't hug her right away. He stood there, taking a deep breath, as if to carve this moment into his heart forever. Then he gently placed the ring on Mara's finger, a slow, careful movement, like someone placing a treasure in its rightful place. The moonlight shone on their hands, one hand, once trembling with loss, holding another scarred by the past. Their hands joined together stronger than any promise. They stood in the orange grove for a long time. Nothing more was said. There was no need to say anything. For older Americans, it's a familiar and cherished moment, a love that doesn't show off, that doesn't explode loudly, but stands by choice. Not salvation. Not blind romance. But an invitation to walk the path together, long or short, calm or stormy. A mature love. A classic promise the Old West holds for hearts that believe in goodness. That night, Mara did not sleep immediately. She sat on the steps watching the ring in the dying firelight. The ring didn't tell the future. But it did say something she'd long forgotten. She could choose happiness and who she wanted to be with. When James came and sat beside her, they didn't need to touch. The silence that surrounded them was the real closeness. And that morning, when Mara and James left Whitford Farm and headed for the sea, they could not have known that just 3 years later Lakeshore Bay would become home, a place where grief is gently laid down, where loss turns to gentle memory, and where the future finds its roots. 3 years in Lakeshore Bay didn't pass as quickly as the wind on the prairie, but it was long enough for two wounded people to be grateful for every dawn they could see. Lakeshore Bay is a small seaside town where waves gently roll onto the sand, carrying with them the familiar smell of salt and rotting wood from old docks. The people here live slowly, appreciate labor, and respect those who quietly build a life with their hands. In that peaceful picture, Mara Ellsworth Rowe stands in front of her shop. A handwritten wooden sign reads, "Mara's Dress and Millinery," crafted with heart and honor. The sign shakes gently every time the wind from the sea passes by, as if greeting guests from small boats arriving at the dock. The shop is not large, but it is as warm as a hearth on a winter day. Rolls of fabric are neatly stacked on wooden shelves, hats with soft lace are placed on long tables. Each product bears the mark of Mara's hand, patient, meticulous, and somehow healing. Lakeshore Bay residents say there's something special about Mara's hats. When you wear them, you feel lighter. Perhaps it's because Mara doesn't just sew with thread, but with everything she's been through, loss, getting back up, and choosing to live a kind life. Mornings at the tailor shop often begin with the laughter of a little girl. Lila Rowe 3 trotted between the rolls of fabric, her father's blue-gray eyes but her mother's gentle gaze. She loved to hold colored ribbons up to the light and smile as if she were seeing magic. "Mom, look," little Lila called, holding out the shimmering lace. Mara bent down and gently touched the soft, sun-scented hair. "It's beautiful, my dear. The sea breeze makes the lace brighter." Lila smiled like a little piece of sun sent by God to fill the places that had been covered by darkness. Every time she looked at her daughter, Mara felt her own rebirth, a rebirth that was not noisy but grew silently like the orange tree in her backyard, growing fragrant day by day without anyone noticing. Not far from the tailor shop, on a plot of land near the edge of the pine forest, a team of workers was building the frame of a new house. Hammers pounded on wood saws, squealed softly. Men talked about their work, all combined to create the soundtrack of life that Lakeshore Bay still prided itself on. In the midst of the group of workers, the tall, familiar figure of James Rowe stood out. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and a shirt rolled up to the elbows, revealing the tanned skin and strong arms of a man who worked with his own strength. Pilots, landowners, lumbermen, blacksmiths, everyone called him by a respectful name, Rowe Builders. Not just the name of the construction team, but a recognition of the dignity and prestige of the man who headed it. James worked as he lived steadily, without boasting, without promising what he could not keep, and always giving more to others than he received in return. Workers often say, working with James is like building a house on solid ground. He just smiled and said nothing. If anyone asked him why he worked so hard, his answer was simply, "I do it so my wife can live a peaceful life. That's all." Every day after work, James stopped by Mara's shop. Not to check on her or help set up anything, he just wanted to watch her work with the peaceful look in her eyes of someone who had found home after a long day. One afternoon, as the sunlight shimmered on the sea, James walked into the shop. "Mara is sewing new lace for Mrs. Whitmore's custom hat." "Worked a lot today?" James asked, his voice warm. "Quite a lot, but I like it. What about you? The house frame is done. Next week we'll go on the roof." James placed a small paper bag on the table. Mara opened it. Inside were silk samples brought from Yorktown. "I think they match your eye color," James said, his face slightly red, looking more like a young man confessing his love for the first time than a man in his late 40s. Mara let out a small laugh, a laugh that had become a familiar sound in this tailor shop. "Thank you, James. I'll use them for a new dress." James went to Lila and picked her up. Lila put her arms around his neck and asked, "Who are you building the house for?" "For a family that is moving here, daughter." "Are they as small as you?" James laughed. "I don't know. But if they do, they'll be lucky." Mara saw that scene, the two people she loved the most standing together in the evening light. The scene made her heart stop for a moment. It wasn't painful, but it felt like it was mixed with a simple happiness that she thought she would never have the chance to touch. In Lakeshore Bay, people loved the Rowe family not because they were rich or powerful, but because of the way they lived. Live kindly, work hard, love each other with sincerity, without embellishment. Mara often thinks peace is not something found overnight, but something we cultivate day by day. And every day that little family's life was filled with simple things: shot cornbread on Sunday night, Lila's laughter as she ran along the beach, James' hand on Mara's shoulder as they sat watching the waves. Those little things, to someone who has experienced loss, are the real miracles. In terms of narrative art, this 3 years later period depicts Mara's growth, from a runaway woman to a famous tailor shop owner. James's stability, from a quiet traveler to a pillar of the family respected by the community. Lila's presence, a symbol of hope, rebirth of the seasons that life gives back after taking too much away. Older audiences will clearly feel the message. Life does not end in pain if people still choose to live kindly and stand side by side. One early summer evening after closing the shop, Mara took Lila for a walk along the beach. The waves lapped gently, leaving a thin white trail like thread on silk. "Mom, will Dad come home early tomorrow?" Lila asked. "Sure, honey. I want to take us to see the new house." "Whose new house is it?" Mara smiled. Her eyes turned to the deep blue sea. "Our home, Lila. Your father spent 3 years building it from the ground up." The wind blew Mara's hair lightly, carrying the smell of sea salt and pine from the forest behind. In that moment she realized that no matter how deep the loss, love, the quiet, slow, unproven kind, can fill the void that seems never to close. But peace, no matter how deep and beautiful, cannot lock the old doors. One early autumn morning in Lakeshore Bay, when the mist still lingered on the sea and the sound of seagulls had not yet reached the dock, news from Ash Hollow quietly reached Mara's house, like the gentle knock of a memory that refused to sleep. The news came in the form of a sealed letter. The postman stood on the porch, his hat pulled down low, his voice low as if afraid to wake whatever was sleeping in the house. "Mrs. Rowe, there's news from Ash Hollow." Mara took the envelope, feeling her fingertips cold as if winter was coming. Just hearing the 3 words Ash Hollow made her heart clench. James was working at the lumber yard by the beach. Lila was taking a nap. Mara stood alone in the kitchen, which still smelled of the cornbread she had baked that morning, and opened the envelope. The first line made her pause, her hand clenching the edge of the paper. "Barnett Price died suddenly while awaiting investigation." Barnett Price. The name had been like a shadow behind her, long, cold, and unfading. Now the shadow had broken, revealing what it had hidden. She read on. While sealing Barnett's possessions, police discovered a safe hidden behind a large painting in his office. Inside were papers no one in town had ever seen before. Owen Ellsworth's first will, which was completely different from the one read in public. A medical certificate, which confirmed that Owen was not suffering from any debilitating disease. At the time he was declared dead of disease. And several secret transaction documents between Barnett and attorney Carlin, who had declared Owen's death to be sudden but natural. Mara put the letter down on the table. The kitchen suddenly became so quiet that she could hear the waves crashing on the rocks in the distance. When James returned that afternoon, he found Mara standing on the porch, a tablecloth in her hand, but not moving. He knew immediately that something was wrong. Immediately, she handed him the letter. James read it slowly, each line sinking into his bones. When he came to the part about the old will, he clenched the edge of the paper tightly, but his voice remained calm. "You don't have to face it alone. Not now and never again." Mara leaned her forehead against his shoulder. No tears, no trembling. Just the feeling of someone who had gone far away from where the pain began, but now was called back to face the truth. At night, while Lila slept, the couple sat by the oil lamp in the living room. The yellow light trembled and fell on the old will that the police had sent a copy of. Owen's handwriting was clear and decisive, unlike the will Barnett had drawn up. In the original will, Owen left no assets to Barnett. He intended to transfer most of the trading post to Mara to run, keeping only a small portion for the benefit of the town of Ash Hollow. James looked at his wife, his voice low but firm. "Owen believed in me. Even in the end, he still placed me in the future of the trading post." Mara nodded, her chest heavy as a stone. "James, if this is true, then Owen's death—" She didn't finish her sentence. No need. James gently placed his hand on hers, not squeezing too hard, just enough for her to feel the warmth. "The truth sometimes comes late, but it is never lost. Now it has found its way back." The full report was sent the next day. In the letter, Sheriff Donovan wrote, "We have reason to believe that Owen Ellsworth's death was not due to illness. We are investigating the possibility of forged wills and manipulation of assets. Barnett Price died before he could give a statement." Mara read this passage over and over again. Each time her heart contracted a little, not with fear, but with pity. She remembered Owen, his gentle smile, his kind eyes, his rough but gentle hand on her shoulder. He was imperfect, but a good husband. The thought that he might have died not because of fate, but because of conspiracy, was a stab at the memory she tried to keep beautiful. James stood beside him, silent, the silence of an experienced Western man knowing that there are pains that do not need words of comfort, just a constant presence. In the evening they went to the beach. The autumn wind blew gently, the blue sea turned the color of soft steel. Mara said slowly, "James, maybe I should go back to Ash Hollow. I know, I don't want anything back for myself. I just want to put the truth back where it belongs." James put his arm around his wife's shoulder, his eyes looking out at the horizon where the sun was slowly setting into the sea. "Owen deserves peace. And you deserve to put this burden down," he added slowly and warmly. "When you go back there, I'll go with you." Mara leaned against him. For the first time in years, the pain of the past was less sharp. It was like a healed scar still there, but no longer keeping her awake. 2 days later, the Lakeshore Bay post office delivered a second envelope, at this time from the young lawyer handling the case. In the letter was a copy of the secret medical bills concluding that Owen was in perfect health, showing no signs of heart failure, as Barnett had claimed, and that the date of his illness in official records coincided with the date he signed the forged will. Mara closed the letter, her hand trembling slightly. The truth doesn't always come in a thunderclap. It comes in waves, little by little, quietly but surely dissolving away the old sand. She knew it was time to return to Ash Hollow, not to reclaim the trading post, not for revenge, but to say Owen's name correctly so he could rest in peace underground, and so she could finally live out the rest of her life. James watched his wife pack the papers into a leather pouch. He didn't ask any questions. There was a soft light in his eyes, the light of a man who has chosen to stand beside the one he loves when the road ahead is dark. And so, on a morning when a thin mist covered the sea like a veil, Mara knew that her journey was not yet over. The path back to Ash Hollow, a place marked by old losses, was suddenly clear, no longer a shadow but a gentle call of truth. Mara's tailor shop was open as usual that morning. But as she stood before the large windows overlooking the sea, her eyes lingered on more than just the waves. They seemed to carry memories of a distant, older place, a place she was afraid to return to. James stood behind her, arms folded, silently observing his wife. He knew that her stance, her sigh, were signs of a decision maturing in her heart. Mara gently placed her hand on the edge of the glass, letting the cold morning air penetrate her skin. She spoke softly but firmly, as if she had just found a piece of the answer that had been lost for a long time. "James, the past made you, but it no longer owns you." James smiled, the smile of someone who knew his wife better than he knew himself. "I know. And you don't have to face it alone." That saying is simple, unadorned, but contains the steadfast support of a Western man. Few words, but every word is a pillar. Mara returned to her desk. There was still the leather bag containing the police papers from the day before, Owen's real will, the medical bills, and the memo from Ash Hollow. She opened the bag, looking at each note one by one, not to relive the pain but to look at them with a different gaze, calmer, more mature. "James," Mara said slowly, "I want to go back to Ash Hollow, not to claim what is mine. I just want to give Owen the truth. He doesn't deserve to be buried in lies." James stepped forward, placing his hand on his wife's shoulder. "If that's what your heart calls for, then let's go." Mara smiled softly, her smile as warm and soft as a summer morning. For the first time in years, she felt the memory of Owen no longer choked her. It was like an old song, sad but beautiful, that had come to an end. That afternoon they took Lila to the small dock at Lakeshore Bay. She ran happily on the wooden planks, her white skirt sweeping her plump legs, her laughter carried on the wind. James bent down to tie his daughter's shoelaces. Mara looked at them, her heart warming up. She suddenly realized it's not the past that holds her back. It's her, the past, who isn't at peace enough to look at it with sympathy. Now, with James, with Lila, with a small house in the middle of a seaside town, she has the foundation to return to the place that once caused pain without fear of falling. That evening, as the family sat eating by oil lamplight, Mara said, "James, do you think the people in Ash Hollow would want to hear the truth?" James put down his bowl, looking at Mara with the calm eyes of someone who had lived through many changes. "Mara, the truth doesn't need to be accepted by everyone. It only needs to be spoken by those who have the courage. The rest is up to God." Lila looked up, her eyes wide open. "Mom, are you sad?" Mara smiled, reaching out to stroke her child's soft hair. "No, honey, I'm just missing someone who was so good to me." Lila leaned her head on her mother's hand and whispered, "So let's tell everyone that good thing, Mom." That simple sentence seemed to sweep away the dust of weariness in Mara's heart. Sometimes children see the world in a way that adults have forgotten, straightforward and kind. The next morning was clear, the sea breeze was as light as a thin cloth across the sky. The small family packed a few things: paper bags, some clothes, a hat for Lila, and a leather bag containing important documents. Before leaving the shop, Mara turned back to look at the wooden sign hanging in front of the door, "Mara's Dress and Millinery, crafted with heart and honor." 3 years ago she fled Ash Hollow with fear. Now she returns with honor and the light of truth. James stood behind, holding her hand. Lila stood in the middle, looking up at her parents with eyes as clear as spring water. "Ready, Mara? Okay, let's go." The train from Hartford blew a long, deep whistle. Passengers began to board the wood, creaking softly under their feet. Mara held Lila's hand. James walked beside her. 3 people, 3 lives, once lost, now walked as one. Before boarding the ship, Mara turned back to look at the sea one last time. The morning mist was gradually clearing, revealing the calm blue water and the long stretch of sandy beach. She spoke softly, not to anyone, just to herself. "The past made you, but it no longer owns you." James heard. He placed his warm hand on her back, gentle but firm. The way a Midwestern man expressed his love, not with words, but with his presence. Lila gently pulled her mother's hand. "Mom, let's get on the train. They're waiting for us." Mara bent down to hug the baby, then walked with James into the train car. The train doors closed and the iron wheels began to roll on the tracks. The sound of the engine mingled with the wind. Through the window, the shore of Lakeshore Bay gradually became smaller, then became a faint strip of light, like a beautiful memory folded and stored away. In the cabin, 3 people sat side by side. No one said anything. No need to say anything. The peace they carry with theme, a peace built from quiet love, from honest work, and from the courageous choice to face the truth, enough to light the path ahead. And older audiences easily recognize the message the story conveys. In life, what matters is not whether we run away from pain, but who we choose to walk with us on the journey towards peace. Looking back at Mara Ellsworth's journey, we see that life doesn't always unfold on a smooth path. There are losses, there are injustices, there are moments of darkness that seem to swallow one's heart. But what this story reminds us gently but deeply is that we are not born to succumb to fate, but to choose how we move forward. Mara did not escape the pain because someone saved her. She stood up because a kind person walked beside her, gave her the support to find her own strength. And that is the biggest lesson. In life, the important thing is not to run away from pain, but to find the right person to walk the path of resurrection with. The truth may come late, but it always finds someone brave enough to speak for it. And love, if it exists properly, is companionship, not salvation. The story also reminds us that creating a peaceful life does not lie in something lofty, but in small choices, every day choosing to live kindly, choosing to keep honor, choosing to believe in goodness, even when the world is sometimes harsh. Thank you for being with us until the end of this journey. If the story touches your heart in any way, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to continue watching other healing stories. Your support is the motivation for us to tell more beautiful stories. See you on the next journey.